Hey everyone, welcome back. This is video 2 for this week. We're talking about the death penalty. We're going to sort of sketch some arguments. So this is going to be a pretty short video. We're not going to go into as much depth on this as we did on, say, utilitarianism or Kantianism or anything like that. But hopefully, if you want to write about arguments for or against the death penalty, or write about the death penalty as a philosophical issue for levels assignments or something, this was some good material that will hopefully be helpful and interesting to at least some of you. So, first things first, what is the death penalty? Well, the death penalty is also called capital punishment, and it's just the government executing someone as a punishment for committing a crime. So someone commits a crime, it's sufficiently bad, whatever the crime is, so the government decides that a fair and fitting punishment for that crime is death. So the government kills the convicted criminal. Now, there are different ways of the government executing people. They're with varying levels of horrifyingness. Some of the ones from the past are pretty gruesome and terrible, and some of the ones from the present aren't that great. We're not going to talk about the methods for the death penalty, but I've read some complaints about lethal injection and other methods not being nearly as humane as we like to think they are. And that's an interesting philosophical question. What sort of method for executions are morally permissible for the government to use if executions are morally permissible in the first place? That's an interesting question, but that's not what we're going to talk about in this video. We're just going to focus on whether or not it is permissible for the government to execute people. We're not going to focus on details of like methodology or the execution of the execution, how the government goes about executing people. So everyone agrees that the death penalty is not acceptable in some cases, right? No one's running around saying that a kid who shoplifts a candy bar should be given the electric chair as a fair and fitting punishment. That's not a view that anyone actually holds. No one thinks that. The only question really is whether or not the death penalty is ever acceptable. We all agree there are some crimes for which the government should not kill you. Even if you've been convicted, even if you admitted it, you should not be given the death penalty, probably for lying under oath, or for shoplifting, or for trespassing on public property, like walking around a park after hours or something. You probably shouldn't be killed for that. But you probably might have heard some disagreements and different people arguing on different sides of whether or not the death penalty is okay for mass murderers and serial killers and other particularly severe crimes, particularly heinous murders, torture, other things like that. The Nuremberg trials in the 40s after World War II ended with executions. It ended with sort of the world governments together executing Nazis who architected the Nazis who were the architects of the Holocaust. The governments tried them in a court, convicted them of crimes against humanity, and executed them by hanging. You might think that that's okay. You might think, hey, shoplifting a candy bar, you probably shouldn't be hanged for that. But designing and executing the Holocaust, you should maybe die for that. Maybe death is a fitting punishment for that sort of thing. So you might think the death penalty is acceptable in some cases. But you also might think the death penalty is never acceptable in any cases. And those are the two views we're going to talk about. That discussion, that question. Is the death penalty ever acceptable? Is the death penalty ever morally okay? That's the philosophical issue that we're going to talk about. And so some argue the death penalty is never permissible. The government should never kill a person as a punishment for a crime. That's never okay. Now, you might think a government should sometimes kill people, like in war. If another country invades your country, you might think it's okay for the government to send soldiers to kill some invading soldiers or something. But as punishment for a crime, a government killing its own citizens as a punishment for a crime, you might think that's not morally acceptable. But others argue that the death penalty is sometimes permissible. When someone is convicted of a particularly severe and heinous crime, the only appropriate punishment is death. Some people say, given a sufficiently terrible crime, the government ought to execute the person who perpetrated that crime. And we'll look at some arguments for and against the death penalty, including deontological arguments and consequentialist arguments. Because deontologists and consequentialists, neither group has like a clear line on this is our view of the death penalty. Some deontologists support the death penalty, some are opposed to it. Some consequentialists support the death penalty, some are opposed to it. So choosing between deontology and consequentialism does not settle the question of whether or not you should support the death penalty, in the way that it does sort of answer the question of what you should do in the trolley problem cases. So first, we'll look at deontology, a little for the death penalty and a little against the death penalty. So here's a deontological defense of the death penalty. The argument is that the death penalty is needed for retribution. Retribution meaning punishment for a crime. That as retribution, to make the world right after a heinous crime has been committed, the only just thing to do is to execute the criminal who committed the particularly terrible crime. So the idea is that punishments should be equal to the crime committed or proportional to the crime committed, right? We all think that probably a stern warning is not a good punishment for a serial killer, but life in prison is also not a good punishment for a shoplifter. You know, punishments that are way too mild aren't good, and punishments that are way too severe aren't good either. Cruel and unusual punishments are cruel and unusual and morally wrong. But incredibly mild punishments don't seem to accomplish anything and basically make it legal to be a serial killer and other things if there's no actual consequences. So you might think, look, punishments for crimes are good, they're important, we should have them as a society, but those punishments should be proportional to the crime. They should be equal to the crime committed. You know, life imprisonment might be reasonable for murder, not for shoplifting. We want punishments that are equal to the crime, that fit the crime. The punishment should fit the crime. That's a phrase people say. So the harm caused by a murder, if we want to look at what punishment should be fitting or equal to murder, if someone commits murder, the harm that they caused is the end of the victim's life. They took away someone's life. So, the argument goes, the only punishment that is equal to that crime is the end of the murderer's life, i.e. the death penalty. An eye for an eye. You know, if you could commit a financial crime, maybe you get a financial punishment. You have to pay a fine or something. You have to pay some financial penalty. You know, but if you commit physical harm to someone, then maybe the fitting punishment is physical harm unto you. So on this view, we need the death penalty because murder, or some murders at least, mass murder maybe, are so bad that anything less than death is too mild. Any lesser punishment would be unjust. Justice would not be served because the person who committed the crime received too light of a punishment. It would be like a slap on the wrist compared to, the death penalty if you just locked them away. The severity of the crime warrants a more severe punishment than just life in prison. They took away someone's life, or they took away multiple people's lives. And so any happiness or pleasure or joy they ever experienced during their life in prison is a slap in the face to justice, because the people they killed don't get that. Will never get that because their life is over. So the only way to do right by the victims, the only just thing to do here, is to end the life of the person who committed these heinous murders, or something like that. Failing to punish people who deserve it, or punishing people too lightly for their crimes, is not a morally good thing to do. It doesn't serve justice to have punishments that are too mild for the crime, the argument goes. So therefore, the death penalty is right, or at least permissible, in cases where the crime is sufficiently bad. Any punishment less severe than death would punish the criminals too lightly, and therefore we as a society would not be doing our moral duty to punish criminals with fair and fitting punishments. So the idea is, as a moral rule, we have a duty to punish criminals fairly with punishments that fit the crime. That is a moral obligation that we as a society have. And if we punish people too severely, we're not living up to our moral duty. If we punish people too mildly, we're not living up to our moral duty. And so the argument is, the death penalty, given sufficiently severe crimes, is the only punishment severe enough to fit the crime. And therefore, the death penalty is right in at least some cases. Not for shoplifting or anything, but for sufficiently heinous murders, mass murders, etc. The death penalty is the only fitting crime, or the only fitting punishment for that crime. Important distinction. But not all deontologists agree with this. Some deontologists have objected to this defense, because they agree that we have a duty to punish people for crimes they commit, but disagree that those punishments ought to be equal to the crime committed. You shouldn't inflict the same punishment or the same harm as punishment that they inflicted in the first place. For example, they say it would be unacceptable for us as a society to torture torturers or to sexually assault people who committed sexual assault. You don't want to live in a society where you can sentence people to be tortured or to be sexually assaulted. That's not the kind of thing the government should be involved in doing. That's not the kind of thing we as a society should have our representative government involved in, the argument goes. Torturing is just wrong. Killing is just wrong. And so the objection is that it's just wrong to kill people. It's just wrong to torture people. And so the government doing that would be wrong. Us as a society killing people would be wrong. Even if the person being killed has themselves killed other people, even if the person being tortured is being tortured as a punishment for torturing other people, it's still wrong to torture them. It's still wrong to kill them, because as a moral rule, killing and torturing are just wrong. And so we should not kill and torture people as a society. And so we should not kill people as punishment for crimes. And therefore, we should not have the death penalty. It is wrong to have the death penalty because it is wrong for us as a society to kill anybody. And that's the objection. So one group of deontologists says we have a moral duty to give fair and fitting punishments for crimes, and for some crimes that are sufficiently heinous and severe, the only fair and fitting punishment is death. So the death penalty should exist. We should have the death penalty. Other deontologists say, look, as a moral rule, we should not kill and torture people, including killers and torturers. We should not kill or torture those people either. So the death penalty is just wrong because it is killing someone, and killing is wrong. The government should not be involved in killing people, at least not killing people as punishment for a crime. Maybe you think the government is killing people when it goes to war, and maybe that's acceptable. That's a side issue. But, if someone commits a crime, no matter how heinous the crime is, the objection goes, it's still wrong to kill them. They haven't, one way to phrase it, they haven't given up their right to life just by violating someone else's right to life. Now, you might think that they did give up their right to life by violating someone else's right to life. That is a view that some people have offered. That's an interesting philosophical issue in and of itself. Can you ever give up your right to life, say by violating someone else's right to life? That's an interesting issue, and there are arguments on both sides. But for now, suffice it to say that the disagreement between deontologists here, or at least there are lots of disagreements, but the disagreement that we're looking at here is a matter of, do we have to follow moral rules to have fair and fitting punishments, where that involves killing people when their crime is sufficiently severe? Or do we have to follow the rule of not killing anybody, even killing people who have killed several other people? Is that still morally wrong? And these are two different deontological positions. This is a disagreement among deontologists. And if you looked at the deontologist or the deontology lecture and you thought that sounded right to you, then you need to decide which camp you want to be in. Are you a pro-death penalty deontologist or an anti-death penalty deontologist? So the deontological defense here argues that justice demands that people who harm others receive proportional and fitting punishments. And in the case of sufficiently severe murders, the only fitting punishment is death. Any other punishment would be so much more mild than the crime that it would be unjust. It would be unfair to the victims. It would be unjust overall. We would not be doing our duty to promote justice and have just and fair and fitting punishments. But the deontological objection to this is that there are some things we just shouldn't do as a society. We cannot greenlight everything. Killing is one of those. A life sentence in prison is severe enough that we are doing our duty to have fair and fitting punishments. And anything more severe than that, torture, murder, etc., would be morally wrong for us to inflict on a person. Even a murderer, even a mass murderer, it would be morally wrong for us to inflict that harm on anybody. That's the objection. So that's deontology, or that's a couple of views you could have as a deontologist. Now let's talk about consequentialism. Some consequentialists support the death penalty. Some are opposed to it. The consequentialists who support the death penalty, they don't argue that the death penalty is a just and fitting punishment for past crimes the way the deontologist does. The consequentialist does not particularly care about what happened in the past, remember, because the consequentialist is going to say the morally right thing to do is whatever has the best outcome. So it's what will have the best outcomes in the future. That's the important question. So consequentialists argue that the death penalty produces good consequences and is therefore morally good. It provides the best consequences. So the defense is often, usually, I would say, based on the idea of deterrence. Deterrence meaning like prevention. So consequentialists argue that the fear or the threat of execution, the fear of the death penalty, being killed by the government, the fear of lethal injection and that sort of thing, deters potential murderers from murdering people. They think you're less likely to murder someone if you think that you'll die if you get caught. You don't want to die, you might get caught, so don't murder anybody. Simple as that. So the thought is, look, the death penalty as this thing that could happen to you if you ever murder someone, that fear of that happening will prevent people from committing murder. And so there'll be fewer murders overall if we have the death penalty. So the argument is that the death penalty deters murders and therefore reduces the overall number of murders. It reduces the number of people who are murdered. And that's a moral good. That's a good thing. Fewer murders is better than more murders. That part's pretty uncontroversial, I think. Fewer murders is better than more murders. And as long as the number of murders that we prevent is greater than the number of murderers we execute, it'll be a net gain in lives. Let's say having the death penalty means we have to execute 100 murderers. If we save the lives of 200 people by reducing the murder rate by 200, or reducing the total number of murders by 200, then that's a net gain of 100 lives. You had to end 100 lives, but you saved effectively 200 lives. So that's a net gain of 100 lives. So good. It's like the trolley problem. 5 lives better than 1 life, so save 5 lives. This is just a mass trolley problem on a society-wide scale. If you execute this group of murderers, or execute a few murderers every now and then there'll be fewer murders because people will be afraid to commit murder because they don't want to be executed. And you'll have fewer murders and more people who get to live and die of, old age and heart disease and, non-murder type causes of death. And that's good. And so you'll save more lives than you have to end. And so, like the trolley problem, you should do it. You should pull the lever on the electric chair or whatever. You should have the death penalty to prevent more murders. And that means that the death penalty is morally good. That's the consequentialist defense. We save more lives than we end, and so we've done a net moral good. However, the consequentialist defense just offered is not uncontroversial among consequentialists. Some consequentialists disagree and object to this defense. And they accept, the consequentialists, that if the death penalty were an effective deterrent, then it would be morally good, because then, you would save more lives than you end, and it would be a net improvement. But that's assuming that the number of prevented murders is greater than the number of executions. Then you'd have a net increase in lives saved. So this is only a good defense for the consequentialist if the number of prevented murders is greater than the number of executions. The problem, the objection, is that there's very little evidence that the death penalty is actually an effective deterrent. States that don't have the death penalty are not, on average, places with a higher murder rate than states that do have the death penalty. States that execute more murderers do not have a lower murder rate than states that execute fewer murderers. On a state-by-state basis, it just doesn't have that much of an effect, it looks like. There's no real evidence that states with a death penalty see any change in the murder rate. When states have made the death penalty illegal, they have not seen an increase in murders. When states made the death penalty legal, so that now you go from no death penalties to now having death penalty executions, they did not see a decrease in murders. So there's actually very little evidence that the death penalty is deterring anyone from committing murder. Turns out people don't want to spend their life in prison either, and most people who commit murder don't expect to be caught and don't really think about the consequences of what happens if they get caught. They just don't want to. They don't want to be caught. They don't think they're going to be caught. They think they're going to get away with it. And so if you think you're going to get away with it, what happens in the hypothetical case where you don't doesn't seem that important to you, I guess, or something like that. But the fact is there's very little evidence that having executions will reduce the murder rate. There's no real evidence that the death penalty is a better deterrent to murder than life imprisonment. And so it seems plausible, therefore, that the death penalty doesn't actually reduce the overall number of murders, or at least not significantly enough for us to have any evidence of it. And in that case, the death penalty is just increasing the number of lives lost. It's just killing people. It's not preventing killings. It's just killings. It's just adding killings to the total. It's not reducing the total number of killings in the country or in the state or in the world or whatever. And therefore, it's morally wrong. It's just the death. That's the only real outcome. Deaths. And deaths are bad. That's why murder is illegal, because death is bad. So it's morally wrong to have the death penalty. If it doesn't actually deter crimes, then it's just a net moral loss, basically. So the consequentialist objection here is that if it were an effective deterrent, then it would be good. But empirically, it looks like it's not an effective deterrent, and therefore it's not morally okay. And that's the consequentialist picture. So some consequentialists say that we should have the death penalty. The death penalty is good because it is a deterrent, and the lives saved by the reduced murder rate outweighs the lives lost in the executions. The objection is that there's very little evidence that the death penalty actually is a deterrent that is reducing the murder rate more than life imprisonment alone would do. Now, I've seen some arguments from people who say, yeah, there's no evidence, but we shouldn't expect state-to-state evidence. As long as it's just out there in the air as a thing that happens, it'll deter the murder rate, but not in a way that we get evidence of. Maybe that argument works, maybe it doesn't. Who's to say? That's sort of beyond the level of involvement I want us to get here. So the last thing I want to talk about on the death penalty, so we talked about deontology, we talked about consequentialism. Now I want to talk about in practice issues, theory versus practice. Because some people have argued that even if the death penalty were morally right in theory, it's not acceptable in practice. And that's because innocent people are sometimes convicted of crimes they didn't commit. That's actually not the only reason. In the reading, you'll see there are a couple different reasons brought up. One is that it's kind of arbitrary when people get the death penalty and when they get life imprisonment. It's up to the jury in most states, and juries are really inconsistent. Also, discrimination is a pretty big factor. For the exact same crime committed, a black person convicted of a crime is way more likely to get the death penalty than a white person convicted of that crime. And that seems like a problem. That's implicit bias that we talked about in the testimonial injustice, the epistemic injustice lecture. That implicit bias, people who have racial biases they don't even realize they have. Yeah, that includes people on juries. And as long as that's the case, the outcome there does not look Good. And so people think maybe for that reason we should not have the death penalty, because it allows implicit biases that people have to have real life and death consequences. And we don't want that. And so there are lots of procedural issues with how the death penalty is executed. No pun intended there. For example, some people have said that the way lethal injection is, I mentioned this earlier, the way lethal injection is done in most states might be way less humane than we think it is, and is kind of close to torture maybe. And that's not good. We don't want that. Torture is probably not a fitting punishment for the government to enact on people. It violates the Geneva Convention and all sorts of international agreements and things like that. So there are lots of procedural issues, problems with the death penalty in practice that might make you skeptical of the death penalty, even if you're okay with it in theory. But the main one I want to talk about here, the main in practice issue that I want to talk about, is innocent people being convicted of crimes they didn't commit. Because this is, I think, the most common issue that I've heard people raise, of sort of the death penalty in practice versus in theory. Innocent people are sometimes convicted of crimes they didn't commit. And that means that the fact that someone was convicted of a heinous crime does not give us a 100% guarantee that they actually committed that crime. People are given the death penalty based on eyewitness testimony of one eyewitness, and that is a worryingly unreliable source of information. Eyewitness testimony is not considered reliable evidence in science or anywhere really except courts of law. Like, you could never publish in a peer-reviewed scientific journal that something is the case because someone says they saw it. That just doesn't work. That's terrible evidence. But you can send someone to die based on it. And so some people have said eyewitness testimony based on one person, that's just empirically, that's not reliable. But people are sentenced to death based on it. So, given that that's not a 100% reliable source of information, and people are sentenced to death based on that, that means sometimes innocent people will be sentenced to death for crimes they didn't commit. Sometimes innocent people are convicted of crimes they didn't commit, and if they're sentenced to death, then sometimes innocent people will be executed. And we know this has happened in at least some cases, thanks to DNA evidence after the fact. Like a higher percentage than you're probably thinking. There have been some studies going back to, with DNA evidence, to cases that were tried without DNA evidence or before DNA evidence, and the innocent percentage is, I mean, it's not like half or anything like that, but it's higher than you'd want it to be. So look, sometimes if we have the death penalty, the fact is sometimes the government's going to kill an innocent person. Sometimes an innocent person is going to be executed. And some people who are okay with the death penalty in theory, who are on board with the death penalty in theory, think that in practice, this is too terrible of an outcome. We should not have the death penalty if we know that it will sometimes involve us killing an innocent person. That preventing the moral wrong of killing an innocent person is worth whatever lesser moral wrong we would do by not killing people who deserved it, let's say. Or whatever reason you might be on board with the death penalty in theory. Some have argued that in practice, the fact that sometimes you will end up in executing innocent people is enough for us to say we should not have the death penalty at all. If you're going to execute innocent people, and you know that is a foreseeable consequence of having the death penalty, then it is wrong to have the death penalty. You should not have the death penalty. So that's the argument, that in practice, the death penalty will involve us sometimes killing innocent people who were wrongly convicted. And as long as that happens, the death penalty is bad and we should not have it. Killing an innocent person is unacceptable in all cases. And if you know the death penalty is going to cause you to do that, then you should reject the death penalty. That's the argument. But others have objected. Some people have argued that, yes, sometimes an innocent person will be executed. That's unavoidable. But they will have gone through the proper channels in the court of law. They will have had opportunities to appeal and so on and so forth. And so the number of innocent people who are executed will, in fact, be relatively small. And so punishing criminals who deserve the death penalty will punish more people who deserve it than we will people who don't. And so overall, that's good. Or will deter more murders by having the death penalty. And so the murders prevented will outweigh the innocent people executed. We'll execute a handful of innocent people, but we'll prevent, hopefully thousands of murders over the years in exchange for maybe a few dozen innocent people who are executed. And that's a worthwhile trade-off. That's just another trolley problem. So if you're a consequentialist, you might say, look, deterring murders is a moral good that outweighs the moral bad of killing innocent people. And so you might think it's a worthwhile trade-off. But you might not. And so what you think about the death penalty in theory might change, might not necessarily determine what you say about the death penalty in practice. You might think it's good in theory, but bad in practice. I don't know anyone who thinks it's bad in theory, but good in practice, but maybe you could think that. I've seen some people argue that the death penalty, we should get rid of the death penalty just because ultimately with appeals and other things, a death penalty sentence ends up costing the government a lot more than life imprisonment does, kind of surprisingly. Death penalties are more expensive than life sentences for the government. So for purely financial reasons, I've heard it argued, morality schmorality, for financial reasons, we shouldn't have the death penalty. And I've also heard that, I've heard people argue that the death penalty, we should have it because it will save the government money over life sentences. So some people argue about it not for morality reasons, but for purely practical, purely financial economic reasons. And it seems like the death penalty would be more expensive or would be cheaper than life in sentencing, but apparently in actuality, it is more expensive. Just as a fun little economic fact there. All right. So that's the end of what I wanted to talk about. Deontologists can fight amongst themselves about the death penalty. Consequentialists can fight amongst themselves about the death penalty. And people who aren't really worried about the theory of morality and just worried about what's happening in practice can also fight about the death penalty. So if you'd like to talk about any of these arguments or about this issue for any of the levels assignments, feel free to do so. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next week.